I'm glad to introduce Dr. Lisa Onken, who is here to tell us about her career path for SSCP's How Did I Get Here video series. Dr. Onken received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology in 1981. She was chief of the Behavioral and Integrative Treatment Branch in the Division of Clinical Neuroscience and Behavioral Research at the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the National Institutes of Health until January 2015. She is now at the National Institute on Aging, also at NIH, in the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, directing their program of research on behavior change and interventions. Her main interest is in the development of behavioral interventions to treat behavioral and emotional disorders, including the treatment of adult and adolescent drug abuse and psychiatric disorders, and interventions to promote healthy aging. She has developed a model of intervention development that integrates basic and applied science, encourages the examination of mechanisms of action of interventions, and stresses the importance of developing interventions that are readily implementable as well as efficacious. Dr. Onken, please describe your career path and tell us about any obstacles or barriers that you overcame along the way. In addition, tell us what has surprised you about your job and what you wish you had known earlier about this type of position.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank you and SSCP for inviting me to do this career path interview. So my career path started with early interests in mental health and mental disorders. Both of my parents are Ph.D. psychologists. And so I grew up with a lot of books on psychology around the house, and actually early exposure even to psychiatric patients. I remember once my father taking me to an event. It was a play that was being offered. It must have been on the hospital grounds of the VA hospital or something like that, but it was for patients as well as staff. It was a play of the Mikado. And I was very young, but I could tell who the patients were. They looked very different. Some of them were wearing hospital gowns. And I remember it made me terribly sad to see them. And I remember thinking how horrible it would be to have a mental disorder. And it seemed at that age even worse than a physical disorder. So I don't remember my parents talking all that much about psychology in the house, but I did read a lot of the books, and I was starting around fourth grade especially. I remember I had an extended illness in fourth grade, and there was very little on television, so I was sneaking downstairs and getting psychology books. And I remember reading Freud's interpretation of dreams, thinking I was actually going to learn how to interpret dreams. That didn't work out so well. But I was struck by, my mother was taught abnormal psychology, and I remember reading some abnormal psychology books at that age, and it just seemed like psychotherapy for severe mental illness was not helpful. This was back, I guess, in the 60s. And there was seeming to be a lot of promise in the development of new medications and understanding the biology of mental disorders. So I remember by the time I was in high school writing papers on biological basis of depression, and went to college and actually didn't want to major in psychology, but ended up majoring in psychology, ended up double majoring in biology and psychology, and was pre-med and thought I might go to med school and follow this interest in biological psychiatry. Ended up dropping the biology major so I could graduate a semester early. I was one class short of a biology degree. had the psych major and ended up applying to grad school in physiological psych. And in my last semester in college, took an advanced seminar in physiological psych, and we were doing these experiments with rats that I had read about, but I guess what I didn't really fully understand when I read these studies was that at the end of the study you sacrifice the animal and you chop off their head. I had all these applications into physiological psych graduate school programs, and I realized I don't want to do physiological psych. And I went through a kind of crisis, like, what am I going to do? I'd applied, and I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. You know, do I just tell them all I don't want to come? Do I go? And I didn't know what to do. So I figured, well, maybe I won't get in anyway. Well, no such luck. I got into a lot of good programs, and I visited most of them, and fell in love with Northwestern. I actually went to Northwestern and tried to surreptitiously change the word physiological on my application to personality, because I noticed that they had a program in biological basis of personality. And I thought, biological basis of personality, you know, surely we're not going to be cutting off the heads of people, so I don't have to worry about that. And it sounded really interesting, but I asked the receptionist, can I do this? And she said, well, you have to talk to the chair of the department. And here he is now. And in walked Dick Bootson. And I ended up telling him I had made a big mistake in applying to physiological, and that I wanted to go into personality. And he was completely, the way Dick Bootson always was, just very accepting, understanding. It was like, no problem, you're accepted, you know, just come. So I chose Northwestern, which was one of the best decisions I ever made. I had an absolutely idyllic graduate school experience. I had Bill Revell was my primary advisor. I worked on individual differences in circadian rhythms under his mentorship. But as I progressed in graduate school, you know, I was always asking questions about how this would relate to some kind of application. And I had done that earlier too. In my physiological classes, I didn't quite understand that other people weren't interested in applying basic science. The reason I was interested in physiological was not just I was interested in physiological, is because I was interested in how could this help, you know, inform treatment development. So I was always asking those same questions in grad school, and ended up doing the clinical psychology degree. Ended up deciding I wanted to actually see patients, although I had no belief in psychotherapy whatsoever. I still had an interest in working with patients. I thought I'd give it a shot. Ended up being hired to teach a psychotherapy course. I think there's no better way to learn something than to teach it. And I was kind of baffled, because patients were expressing how much I was helping them by doing psychotherapy with them. And I thought, well, you know, can I believe this? Are they just telling me what I want to hear? I mean, we all know that psychotherapy isn't effective, that, you know, medications are the way to go, or at least the way we should try to go. But I started reading more about what had happened in the field since since I was in fourth grade in terms of psychotherapy research and behavior therapy research, and I was just very impressed with especially what had gone on in the anxiety disorders line of research, that they had really been developing very good potent treatments, behavioral treatments. And I did work it was all in Chicago, which at that time was a heavily psychoanalytic city. And there were very few places where the clinical psychology training in Chicago at that time, I know it's very different now, but at that time there was very little interest in research, at least in the settings that I was in. And I very much wanted to stay in Chicago. I guess this was one of the obstacles. It wasn't really an obstacle, but that a lot of people face. I wanted to stay where my husband was. And I was told that if I had left Chicago, I could have gone to like an internship that was much more grounded in science and research. But I wanted to stay in Chicago. So at one point, I thought that I might have regretted that, because so much of my clinical training was not science-based. And in fact, you know, whenever I asked questions about, well, what research is there to support what you're telling me to do, it wasn't very well received. You know, that was something that surprised me. I guess I thought that everybody would want to know if there was data supporting the treatments that were being given, but it turned out that that wasn't the case. So I had a lot of very good clinical supervisors, some from my program at Northwestern, Dick Bootson and Ken Howard. And I also had a lot of, I also saw a lot of things that I thought were perhaps not helpful to patients, perhaps even harmful to patients. I remember being taught by more than one clinical supervisor that certain mental problems were due to repressed memories of sexual abuse. And of course I asked, well, where can I read about that? What's the data? How do we know that? Well, it turns out we didn't really know that. And, you know, there's been a lot of research since then discrediting that whole kind of repressed memory therapy. But, you know, I saw it at the time and I thought, you know, there really needs to be more research on what makes good therapy and what makes therapy not so good. So I had this strong interest in psychotherapy research that was emerging, but I actually thought, well, I didn't want to go into an academic position because, again, personal family reasons. I didn't want to do a postdoc in one city and move to a non-tenure track position and move to another, you know, till I was 40 years old. So I thought, well, who's going to hire me to pursue my interest in psychotherapy research? So I ended up first teaching at Northwestern for a year while my advisor had been sabbatical. Then I did clinical work at the University of Illinois Medical Center, seeing faculty, staff, students, graduate students in the counseling center there, which I loved. I actually loved all the clinical work that I had done. And then we moved to the DC area and I got a job at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, doing research on the effects of benzodiazepines on sleep latency and performance. So I kind of missed the clinical work, but knew I didn't want to do full-time clinical. Really felt kind of at a loss. Walter Reed wasn't satisfying in a lot of ways. I liked doing research. I liked designing the studies. I liked analyzing the data. The process of conducting the study, the length of time it took to get the study done, it seemed very slow-paced to me. So I got a call out of the blue from NIDA, asking me to apply for a position to run their program on psychotherapy research for drug addiction treatment. Well, interestingly enough, I mean, at that time, drug addiction treatment was probably the only part of psychology I wasn't interested in, but I was very interested in psychotherapy research, and I understood that people with drug addiction tend to have a lot of comorbid mental illnesses, and I thought, well, maybe it'll be interesting. And actually, obviously, I took the job at NIDA. That was in 1987, and became very interested in drug addiction treatment research. It was almost the perfect job for me. So I guess there weren't any obstacles in getting it. It was just one of those things that sort of was handed to me. I didn't even know how they found me. It turned out I was on some list from Walter Reed. They had access to my CV. They saw that I had a clinical psychology degree. They saw that I had done research with drugs, benzodiazepines and caffeine and et cetera. And the person who hired me saw that I had, one of my references was Ken Howard, who founded the Society for Psychotherapy Research. So he just gave me a call. So that was many, many years ago, and I felt like I had landed like the perfect job. It was kind of funny because my father had been a branch chief at NIMH, but I really didn't know very much about what he did. You'd think that I would have been in the perfect position to know what he did, to know these jobs were available, and to pursue one, but I didn't pursue it. And for some reason, I had it in my head that I didn't want a government job, but there you have it. That's what I got. One of the reasons I thought it was such a good fit for me was the pace and the breadth. I mean, the first week I was there, I went to a meeting with, the foremost experts in drug addiction treatment. And so you also had very good access, obviously, to the people who were the leaders in the field. And you had this vision of what was going on in the field that was not really obtainable from anywhere else. I mean, you could certainly read journals and get a pulse of the field. You could go to scientific meetings and get a pulse of the field, but in these jobs at NIH, you could, you're interacting with the applicants doing research before it even comes in the door. So I liked having that kind of perspective, and I liked the various activities that were involved, which was a lot of interaction with the field, a lot of meetings with the field, a lot of thinking about where does the science need to go, how do I strategically structure things in order to make that happen. The only thing I missed was I actually still miss doing actual clinical work, which I chose not to do because I had 2 young babies, and my job was full-time, and I didn't feel like I could add one other activity. So it kind of, you asked what surprised me. I guess it surprised me how great these jobs can be and how few people really even consider it as a career choice. And even I, who grew up in the DC area with family who were in the field, I should mention my sister was a division director at NIMH. I guess at that point she wasn't a division director, but she was at NIMH. So of all the people who should have known, I should have known, but I actually probably wouldn't have pursued it if I hadn't have been pursued. So the other thing that was really good about this job, I mean, in almost every setting that I had been before, my interest in both basic science and applied science, and how does the basic science relate to the applied science, my interest in research and practice, if anything, it was held against me. You know, in the clinical settings, oh, I was the researcher. In research settings, I was the clinician. At NIH, I think it was actually, for the first time, an advantage to have an interest and some background in bridging, you know, basic and applied science. And also the background in actual clinical practice and bringing interventions, you know, up from the basic science all the way through to implementation. So the challenges were many. I mean, I was at NIDA for 27 years, and there were ups and there were downs. I mean, there were budgetary highs and budgetary lows. The budgetary highs presented their own unique challenges. It's great to have lots of funding, but then you need to make sure you spend it well. The budgetary downs obviously have challenges too. But some of the greatest challenges, I think, came from within the field itself, and specifically the silos within the field. So I was not totally aware of how little clinical research at that time, and even now, how little of it actually tests mechanism of action of behavioral treatments. And I realized that testing mechanism of action of behavioral treatments is essentially asking a basic science question about mechanisms of behavior change that are not necessarily part of the training that one gets everywhere in a clinical psychology program. So there might be very good training in doing very elegant, rigorous clinical trials, but those clinical trials don't usually have a focus on mechanism. So I realized there was a need to bring basic scientists together with intervention developers to get a better handle on how to test mechanism of action of behavioral treatments. And the reason for that is, for one, I think it's a good way to build a progressive science, a progressive cumulative science, but also I think it has huge practical implications that if you understand mechanisms, then you can develop your treatments in such a way to be maximally potent and also implementable without diminishing the potency. If you don't understand mechanism, I think it's much harder to do that. And that was one of the other challenges, was the people who were developing the treatments would develop these wonderful interventions, but would not necessarily take the next step and put them into an implementable form and things like that. So this was some of the reason for developing the conceptual framework that you mentioned in the introduction was to try and get the field to maximize what it could do best, and to really get those treatments, those efficacious treatments, out to the people who really need them the most. So all in all, I would, anyone who's looking for a career that is very much connected to research, very much having an effect on research, and also potentially having an effect on what actually ends up happening in the real world, I would recommend looking into some of these jobs. What surprises me, you asked? I'm tempted to say nothing surprises me anymore. I mean, I've been at it a long time, and I've seen a lot of things. What used to surprise me was the lack of connection between basic research and applied issues. I guess I was just always just made up in a certain way. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Pastor's Quadrant. Pastor's Quadrant talks about the link between understanding fundamental basic knowledge and applying that knowledge, and really doesn't see so much of a distinction between basic and applied. I never did either, and was just always caught off guard early in my career, making comments that were perceived as inappropriate. As I said, like in physiological psych classes, asking, "Oh, how can this actually have relevance?" and "Who cares?" was kind of the reaction I would get. So that would surprise me, because that's been my my greatest interest. So NIH has been a great place to pursue the bridging of the basic and applied, to have exposure to multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary science. Of late, I say of late, I guess it's been probably 8 or 9 years, I've been very involved in the NIH initiative on the science of behavior change, which really encompasses just about everything I've been talking about today, about bridging basic and applied science and really understanding mechanisms. So that's been a wonderful thing too. So there you have it.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Onken, for your participation.
You're welcome.